Over the past few months on this channel, we've explored the various mystery engines of Sodor, or seeing how characters from one version of the timeline would work in another. Today, however, I just felt like doing something simple and fun. The highly sophisticated process of selecting two random characters from Thomas and Friends and mashing them together to create some weird abomination. I've decided to make 3 of these weird abominations for this video, which I will start drawing now. For the purposes of these drawings, I've created this wheel. I suppose you could say that it's quite unwieldy. Incidentally, I apologise if the footage of the spinning wheel looks a bit hideous. There wasn't much I could do about that. For the first drawing, I'll be combining Norman and Victor. So that's an interesting combination right off the bat. I've got to combine a standard gauge diesel engine with a narrow gauge steam engine. For what it's worth, I'm not basing these engines on any specific class. Rather, I'm just combining elements of both engines' appearances to create something that looks at least halfway presentable and cohesive. Since I was combining a steam engine and a diesel engine, I figured it may be worth taking some inspiration from the various steam outline narrow gauge diesel engines generally used for railways at country parks, amusement parks, zoos and so on, as a lower maintenance alternative to actual steam engines. Some of these actually do a decent job at looking like steam engines, but it's the more scuffed looking ones that I'm more interested in. The quote-unquote smokebox and boiler are sort of art-shaped, basically a midpoint between Victor's round smokebox and boiler with Norman's bonnet, which is more of a slightly rounded cuboid shape. The front of this engine is also slanted back, much like Norman. I'm not immediately aware of any steam outline diesel engines that are made to look like saddle tank engines, although I imagine they probably exist. Either way, I've left them off. However, Victor also has these appendages on the sides of his boiler that look a bit like side tanks, so I've decided to add them to this creature. The cab takes elements from both engines. The roof is maybe closer to Norman's and the sides are more like Victor's. I've drawn the front cab windows to more closely resemble Norman's, or rather his basis. As for the wheels, I've decided to take elements from both engines once again. This engine is an 040 with spoked wheels like Victor, but like Norman he has long side rods and lacks outside motion or the yellow lining around his wheels. As I implied at the start of the video, these engines are just a bit of a laugh and not necessarily new additions to the Rexeljet lore that I've been establishing over the course of these videos. But I suppose I can still come up with a little backstory, as a treat. Vickman, for that is now his name, spent most of his life at a country park on the mainland, working a short railway line that looped around the park. Although he did his job well, railway enthusiasts turned their noses up at him because he wasn't a proper steam engine. At first, Vickman didn't let this get to him, but when the park replaced him with a different engine, either a more convincing steam outline diesel or maybe even a real steam engine, those remarks started rattling around in his bonnet. He was sold off to the North Western Railway to help Victor with the workload at the Sodor Steamworks, and when Vickman realised he was going to be surrounded by steam engines, he began to worry that they wouldn't want anything to do with him. He was wrong, of course. As long as he did his job well enough, it didn't really matter, and the engines even grew fond of him after getting to know him as an engine. With all that said, here is the finished picture. Next on the agenda we have a combination of Sketchbook and Flora. So once again we're combining narrow gauge and standard gauge, although both are steam engines in this case. I once again made this hybrid design a narrow gauge engine. My logic being that whilst Flora is a standard gauge engine in the show, some engines of her type in real life worked on narrow gauge lines, such as the Port Stewart tramway. Flora was one of the engines introduced in Season 12 of Thomas. Season 12 has been considered by many fans to be the worst season of the show. I'd probably have to rewatch all of the bad seasons to form an educated contribution to this topic, and frankly I'd rather not subject myself to that, but Season 12 always felt like the most nothing burger season of the show, as in you could remove it from existence and nothing would change. From what I remember, it very much felt like the people working on it were just going through the motions, even more so than the seasons that came before it. And whilst new characters were introduced, none of them ever appeared afterwards, and as far as I'm aware there were never any plans to do anything with them beyond their single appearances. But we're not here to rant about Season 12, we're here to make a totally original character by mixing a Season 12 character with an Audrey character. Like before, this apparition isn't based on a specific engine, but I did take cues from real life engines such as the steam trams that worked in Austria. Much like Flora, this engine has tram skirts, albeit with a cutout section to make the wheels visible. I decided to draw that one set from Season 4 that goes by many names: Valley View, Woodland Way, Lakeside Run By, whatever you want to call it. I've always just called it the picnic area. This location has always been a favourite of mine, and I haven't drawn any TV series locations in any of these videos yet, so this seems like a good excuse to start. With the last drawing, selecting a colour for the engine was relatively straightforward because Victor and Norman have vaguely similar colour schemes. Meanwhile, Sketchbook and Flora are in completely different liveries. In the end, I decided to paint the top half of the engine yellow or off-white, whereas the bottom half was painted red. I quite like this colour scheme because it has an almost crimson and cream vibe about it, similar to old British Railways or even Isle of Man coaches. As for a backstory for this engine, it's hard to know for certain why an engine like this would have been purchased, since there are no tram lines on the Sketchbook Railway, at least not in the books. But then I remembered that in the TV series there's the village square that appears in a couple of episodes, with rails sunken in like a tramway. Maybe in this universe there's a short tram road that serves the village square, and whilst the other engines have been known to run it occasionally, most trains are pulled by this engine, which I've called Scorer. Again, I'm not seriously considering these engines as lore accurate, so this likely won't have any bearing on future videos. But with that said and done, here is the completed image. For the final drawing, I decided to shuffle the entries in the wheel because I kept landing in the same general area. This drawing will be combining Stanley and Skiff. So I've got to combine a steam engine with a boat on wheels. There was one thing that sprang to mind at first, and that was steamboats. I had a look at some small steamboats and noticed that they tend to have vertical boilers as opposed to Stanley's horizontal one. So I gave this creature a vertical boiler, but as if to make up for it, I made his cabin basically a carbon copy of Stanley's cab. Since he's steam powered, it made sense that the wheels would have to be driven rather than free rolling like skiffs. I've given him cylinders on his sides that connect to his wheels via rods. I'm not sure how this engine /boat would work on water. I dare say not very well. I also figured that it would make sense to give him buffer beams, since it seems likely to me that he would pull trains if he was steam powered and ran on rails. At the very least, he must surely be capable of shunting. As with the Victor and Norman hybrid, Stanley and Skiff are both similar-ish colours, both being a sort of light grey or off-white. Stanley's red lining won out against Skiff's brown and later blue lining. You may notice that at first, I painted this engine's wheels grey. I'd somehow forgotten that Skiff's wheels are actually red like Stanley's, so truthfully it would only make sense to have this guy's wheels painted red as well, which you'll see in the final picture. For the face, I decided to put it in the same location as Skiff's face, mainly because I couldn't think of anywhere else to put it. The facial features themselves are more in line with Stanley's. Now what could this engine's backstory be? Maybe he was acquired by or gifted to Captain Joe as a means of easing Skiff's workload. He looks down on Skiff at first for not being self-propelled, but during a particularly hot summer a hosepipe ban is put in place, meaning that poor Staniff, as I've called him, has to stay shut up in the shed while Skiff is able to run the railboat tour service on his own. And so, here is the finished drawing. And there we are, 3 engines, each created by combining 2 existing Thomas characters. This has probably been the wackiest of these videos to make so far, and I'm definitely up for doing more if enough people are interested. I could make some changes to the wheel in future videos, since it's missing Railway Series exclusive characters, as well as the Arlesdale engines and most of the international engines. Let me know what you think by commenting down below, and subscribing for more.